Hey Pablo, hey Preeti, how are you guys?
Hi, Darcy.
Nice to see you, Darcy. Thank you.
Sure,
And
it's
welcome.
good to see you guys too. I guess this is the only way, even though we're just up the road, this is the only way we're going to see each other for a while.
Just for a little bit longer. In a tile format. That's how we all meet these days.
Exactly.
Yes. So it's great. Great to have you here, Darcy. And yes, we are all part of a big puzzle. These little tiles that, yes. So, how are things in Delaware?
Good. Maggie just defended on Friday and she did awesome,
Yeah.
as you can expect from
Yes.
Maggie. So yeah, so we're doing great. That was a real highlight of 2020 for me. There hasn't been too many things to celebrate, but that was a good one.
Great. Yes. It's great.
And she's super excited to come
Yeah.
down and work with you guys. It's like she's coming full circle now.
It's kind of full circle.
We're excited to have her.
Yeah. So we stop for a minute or two, I think, and then we're gonna be launching Darcy. I think people are joining in. Maybe I just talk some stuff while we're stalling for folks to join in, because what I'm gonna say, it's always not as important. And so um, while we wait for more people to join in, I think this is great. Everybody, thanks for coming. I will not talk too long, so we don't get too delayed. I hope that folks have been enjoying and appreciating the posters that we have all this morning through the PM&R Clinical Expo that we do this once a year. This year in a new format via Zoom and Team. I think they are great. It's a great comprehensive demonstration of work that is happening in many different places and how vast the activities are. I think that I joined into some of those posters, so if I couldn't join into other folks' posters, don't get upset. There was not enough time to visit all of them. Um, so let's get a little bit organized here. I just want to make a couple of announcements. One is if you're not talking, please keep your Zoom on mute so we don't interfere with the conversation. I think maybe Jack is the organizer on this Zoom, so he can keep everybody in mute as we go. I will let Preeti do the formal introduction of Darcy. Although I just want to say Darcy is a great friend and colleague that we worked together here many years ago when Darcy used to be here long ago in Nameless Lab. So it's great to have you back in a completely different capacity. So it's awesome. I just want to make a little announcement for the entire PM&R department, all the folks who are joining here. Typically, this time of the year, besides celebrating the clinical research activities, we always announce that we have a holiday party. As you probably know, there is not going to be a holiday party this year, which is unfortunate. But we cannot get together and eat and so on all together. So the holiday party committee got together and looked for an alternative thing to do, and they decided to and they proposed, and we have approved at this point, that we're gonna do a nice holiday gift for everybody in the department. So the work may be a little bit slow because some people are getting sick due to COVID and so on. But the intent is to have three options, so people will be able to choose a nice gift coming from PM&R. It's going to be a choice of a backpack, a messenger bag, or a donation. If you prefer not to take the gift and you want to repurpose that money towards a donation, we will do that for those who prefer to do that. So I just, since I know there is a lot of attendance here today, I wanted to make that announcement. We also will be sending this via email. So with that, I let Preeti do the formal introduction.
Okay, thank you, Pablo. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Darcy Reisman. She's our keynote speaker for the 10th Annual PM&R Research and Clinical Expo. For many of us, she needs no introduction, but briefly, she's a physical therapist by training with a focus in neurorehabilitation from the College of St. Scholastica in Minnesota. She subsequently did her Ph.D. in biomechanics and movement science at the University of Delaware under Dr. John Scholes. And then she did her postdoc right here at Hopkins and Kennedy Krieger with Dr. Amy Bastian. And that was a while ago, but there's been a long-standing association. And now she's the chairperson of physical therapy at the University of Delaware. And she will talk to us on factors impacting recovery of walking after stroke. So without further ado, thank you, Darcy, for coming, and please take it away.
Thanks so much, Preeti. It's fun. I was scrolling through the all of the tiles, and I still recognize a lot of names, even though, oops, that's not what I meant to share. Hold on. I still recognize a lot of names. So I saw Jen Keller and Mark Hopkins, and so it's fun to see all those names. I think Mike Schubert's on there as well. All right, so I'm super glad to be here today. I did get to a couple posters, and it always amazes me. I'm familiar with the expo because I'm part of the residency that the neuro PT residency that Johns Hopkins has with Delaware, and so we've had residents present in the past. So, but I've never gotten to go, and so this is one of the benefits of virtual, right? Is that I actually could go and check it out, and it was great to see all the. I think the diversity of the work is what really impresses me the most. All right, so today I'm going to talk about one aspect of the work that we're doing. We have sort of two lines of research in the lab. One is a more mechanistic line of research that's really looking at some basic things related to motor learning. And another line of research in the lab is a little bit more clinically oriented, directly clinically oriented, looking at factors that are impacting walking recovery. So I'm going to talk about that today. And then I'll just mention a little bit at the end some of the work we're doing with motor learning. And if people have questions about that, I'm certainly happy to take them if we have time. So the objectives, I won't read them for you, but really I just want you to, at the end of this talk, to really be able to identify some factors that impact functional mobility and physical activity after stroke, and some potential novel interventions, or at least theoretical interventions that we could be applying to directly affect those factors. I don't have any financial or non-financial disclosures. I always like to start all of my talks with just kind of orienting everybody to sort of the basis of the work that we do in our lab, regardless of whether it's more mechanistic or whether it's more clinical. The overarching goal is to develop scientifically based therapies that advance physical rehabilitation and recovery after stroke. And really the foundation of our work is based on the World Health Organization ICF model. I'm sure most of you on this call are familiar with this model. It's really relevant to the work I'm going to be talking about today, because I think what we're really trying to do at this point in our work in the lab is take a very comprehensive approach to how we're trying to understand the factors that are really impacting walking recovery and physical activity after stroke. That includes looking at the body function and structure, activity and participation level, excuse me, but also considering environmental and personal factors, and how all of these things interact, and how we can after we understand that, then how we can tackle these factors in more personalized type interventions. So I don't have to tell folks on this call that stroke is a major cause of disability in the United States and is a major healthcare problem. And one of the primary concerns for people who experience stroke is the ability to regain walking function. And this is a really well-founded concern, because We know that the regaining the ability to walk after stroke predicts lots of things that are important to our patients, like whether they're going to be able to be discharged to home, whether they're going to be able to return to work, etc. And therefore, walking retraining is a major focus of rehab following stroke. And with this major focus, 70 to 80% of stroke survivors recover the ability to walk short distances, but less than 20% recover unlimited walking in the community. And this is what's really, really critical, I think, about the work that we're doing now. Of course, it's a basic prerequisite to returning home to be able to walk those short distances. But really, for our patients to be able to live the kind of lives that they want to live and the kind of lives that we would like them to be able to live, they really need to be able to have that community mobility. And right now, really less than 20% of stroke survivors are able to do that. And so this really suggests to us that current locomotor rehab interventions, while beneficial, really aren't leading to the recovery of that true community functional mobility that we would like to see. And so for the majority of this talk, we're going to be talking about why that might be the case and what we can do about it. So this is sort of the model that we have in our lab. At the hub of the model is walking recovery. And then we are tackling the ability to recover walking after stroke from various facets. I mentioned that we have a lot of work in the area of motor learning, biomechanics, neurophysiology, cardiovascular physiology, but then what we're going to be talking about a lot today sort of fall into this realm of sort of biopsychosocial factors and a little bit in the realm of biomechanics and cardiovascular physiology, but at the much more functional and clinical level. But again, just with this overarching approach, we're trying to look at all the different aspects of factors that might influence walking recovery. We know that walking activity after stroke is very limited. This is some work that we did back in 2012 with Darcy, who was a Ph.D. student at the time and is now a faculty member at University of the Sciences in Philadelphia. She's a PT. And essentially what these graphs show is that when you take the classic Perry classifications of walking, which break people down based on walking speed into household ambulators, limited community ambulators, unlimited community ambulators, and you look at the steps per day based on those categories and the bouts of walking per day, what you see, at least in our work, is that there's really no difference between the household ambulators and limited community ambulators in the number of steps per day that they take or in the bouts of walking per day that they do, and so we combine them into one group. There is a significant difference between those who are household and limited community ambulators and those who are classified as unlimited community ambulators based on their walking speed. And then yet again, another significant difference between those folks with living with chronic stroke in those categories and age and gender matched healthy adults. And what you can see here is that even those that are classified as unlimited community ambulators are taking a significantly lower number of steps per day than their healthy counterparts and have significantly lower bouts of walking per day. And this is not unique to our work. This has been shown repeatedly in the literature. I just have some statistics up here for you. The average daily step counts in stroke really range between very, very low number of steps, around 1,000 steps per day, up to a more respectable number of a little over 7,000 steps per day. Just for comparison's sake, if you look at the average number of steps in age-matched controls to these step counts in patients living with chronic stroke, you're looking at averages between 6,000 and 14,000 steps per day. So you can see that this amount of daily walking activity is really, really low in patients living with chronic stroke compared to age and gender matched controls, or healthy people, I should say. There was a recent study that I want to draw your attention to that I think was really informative, taking data from the LEAPS trial. The LEAPS trial was a very large clinical trial looking at interventions to improve walking speed in patients in the subacute phase of stroke. But they did also collect step activity data using a stepwatch activity monitor. And what they found from when they looked at this data was that really there was if you look at the 12-month time point, which was their final time point in this study, the step activity factor that could really distinguish between those who took greater than 5,500 steps per day compared to those who took less than 5,500 steps per day were really the bouts of walking per day and the steps per bout. And so those things really distinguished who were in this higher category of steps per day and who were in this lower category of steps per day. And what they concluded in this paper is that in addition to encouraging longer bouts of walking, it may be very practical to be encouraging patients to take more short bouts of walking. And I think this is a really, really important recommendation that is going to play into a bit more of what we're talking about later. But I just want to introduce that and have you keep that in the back of your minds as I'm talking. We know that in addition to stroke survivors not being very active in terms of their steps per day, and by the way, these steps per day are typically measured with basically fancy pedometers or research grade pedometers that really give us a good bit of information about what people are doing like outside of the clinic, right? This is what's happening in their real world activity. These monitors are usually, patients are wearing them from 3 to 7 days and asked to wear them usually either all the time or at least during waking hours to give us a good sense of what's happening in their everyday life. And it should be no surprise that if this information is telling us that they have low steps per day, but the converse of that is that patients living with chronic stroke are very sedentary. And this is sedentary behavior measured using the F.A.P.T.A, which is a research grade activity monitor at 1, 6, and 12 months after stroke. It's important to recognize that in this study, they did have patients wearing the F.A.P.T.A 24 hours a day, so this is including sleeping time. But what you can see is that out of the 24 hours in a day, the sedentary time is around 20 hours. So really there's only 4 hours of the day at the 12-month mark that patients with stroke are not completely sedentary. And even if this is not your area of research study, you certainly know from the popular press that the sedentary time, high levels of sedentary time, have very, very significant health consequences. And that's no different for patients with stroke. So, okay, patients with stroke, I hope I've convinced you now, they're not as active as they need to be in terms of their walking activity in their everyday lives, and they're highly sedentary. So what are we going to do about this? Well, we know from a pretty large body of literature at this point that walking training at higher intensities appears to result in greater changes in things like walking speed and walking endurance. And in fact, I was part of a clinical practice guideline group that we just published this large clinical practice guideline that really, one of the major outcomes I think of importance from this clinical practice guideline was this idea that it seems like training intensity and repetition is really, really important to have significant outcomes in changes in walking speed and walking endurance. But we're not really talking about laboratory measured or clinically measured walking speed and endurance in this talk. We're really talking about sort of this more real world walking activity, this things like steps per day, bouts of walking per day, what's happening in our patients' everyday life. And so, when you're thinking about what we understand about the effects of walking training after stroke on speed and endurance, you might think, well, okay, if we can positively affect people's slow walking speed and poor endurance through these interventions, well, that should have a positive effect on inactivity and hopefully break this vicious cycle that we see in patients living with stroke between physical activity, disability, and increased health risks, right? So we know that not being very physically active and being highly sedentary is a major contributor to this vicious cycle of disability and increased health risks. And so given what we know about the importance of these interventions in improving walking speed and endurance, one might think that this would be a great way to intervene and impact this vicious cycle. But it turns out that training at higher intensities does not generally result in substantial changes in real-world walking activity. So while these training at higher intensities and with high repetitions does seem to have a very significant impact on walking speed and endurance, it's not a given that translates into people's everyday activity when they're living with chronic stroke. And I'm sure if you think about this, it probably makes a lot of sense to you if you work with patients with stroke, why this might be the case. There's probably lots of things other than just someone's physical ability to walk that impacts how much walking they do. I'm going to give you a perfect example that COVID has really highlighted for me. So up until late summer, early fall, I was working primarily from home. And on average, I was pathetically getting about 2,000 or 2,500 steps per day if I didn't actively try to do something other than sit at my computer all day long. I certainly have the physical walking speed ability, walking endurance ability to be much more physically active. But my circumstances of working from home were having a major, major impact on how many steps per day I take. When I am in the office, as I am today, I just, by the very nature of being in my office, am taking on the order of 8,000 to 10,000 steps per day. And nothing really changed about my physical ability during COVID. It was really just, my social circumstances of where I was working. So I think, it makes a lot of sense then that, it's not just someone's physical ability that really impacts how physically active they are in their everyday life. And so just tackling improvements in their ability to, walk faster and walk longer may not be enough. And in fact, in some large systematic reviews that have been done, we know that physical capacity really only accounts for about 35 to 40% of the variance in real-world walking activity after stroke. And there's lots of other factors that really play into how active people are in their everyday life. And you can see some of those on this schematic here. Things like self-efficacy, depression, environmental factors. And in fact, in the systematic review, they really broke down these factors into non-modifiable factors, things like age and sex, and potentially modifiable factors, things like physical function, fatigue, falls self-efficacy, balance self-efficacy, depression, health-related quality of life. These are things that over a series of studies seem to potentially be factors that really are impacting step activity and physical activity in people living with chronic stroke and are potentially modifiable. And I think that we can all really appreciate that a lot of the interventions that we do in my research and in physical therapy in general are really targeting physical function, but not necessarily targeting some of these other factors that are accounting for that, 60 to 65% of the variance that's not accounted for just by physical capacity. And, one of the things that we're really trying to understand in our lab is not only what are these factors, but how do they interact with each other? And so we did some work back in 2016 with a team of folks in my lab where we looked at this in about 55 chronic stroke, in exactly 55 chronic stroke survivors. And what we did is basically a hierarchical regression where we put in some measures of walking capacity first into the hierarchical regression, and then we put into the regression biopsychosocial factors. We use the geriatric depression scale, which is a screening tool for depression. We use the fatigue severity scale and the modified cumulative illness rating scale to try to capture, this measure tries to capture comorbidities. We put those next into the hierarchical regression. Then after that, we put in measures of self-efficacy, specifically the Walk 12 and the Activities Balance Confidence Scale, the ABC. And then finally, into the hierarchical regression, we put interactions, and specifically an interaction that we were interested in was the interaction between the activities balanced confidence scale and the functional gait assessment. And what you can see down here is the R-squared values at each of these different blocks of the hierarchical regression. And what you can see is that walking capacity, as we would have predicted, does account for about 36% of the variance in step activity. I should have mentioned that what we were trying to predict in this hierarchical regression was step activity measured using a stepwatch activity monitor that the patients wore in their daily life, so outside of the clinic. And you can see, as you would have expected, as I said, as you would expect, walking capacity accounts for about 36% of the variance. Interestingly, the biopsychosocial factors, when they were included in the model, they did increase the R-squared value to just about 41%, but it was not a statistically significant increase. When we added the measures of self-efficacy, the R-squared value went up to about 57%, and this was a significant increase. And then when we added the interaction between self-efficacy and our physical capacity as measured by the F.P.T.A, or functional gait assessment, the R-squared value again significantly increased to about 61%. So this model, when all of these factors were included, accounted for about 61% of the variance in daily physical or daily walking activity in our patients with stroke, and the overall model was significant. So again, this is an example of how these various factors above and beyond physical capacity are playing a role in essentially how active folks are in their everyday lives. But what we were very interested in was this interaction between self-efficacy and functional capacity as measured by the F.P.T.A. So I want to describe that a little bit further here with this figure from the paper. We have the F.P.T.A on the x-axis and steps per day on the y-axis. And we have one standard deviation below the mean. The mean is represented here in the middle. We have one standard deviation below the mean on the F.P.T.A, represented in this leftmost circle, and the rightmost circle is plus one standard deviation of the scores on the F.P.T.A. And then each line here represents either a high ABC score, that means scores that were above one standard deviation of the mean ABC score. The mean ABC score is represented by the dark black line, and then this medium gray line representing the low ABC score. And what you can see is that for people with low balance confidence self-efficacy, there's a strong relationship between their physical capacity as measured by the F.P.T.A and their steps per day, such that the people with the highest scores on the F.P.T.A have the highest steps per day. However, in direct contrast, for people with very high balanced self-efficacy, the line is flat. The relationship between the F.P.T.A and steps per day is flat. And so what this suggests is that even people with low scores on the F.P.T.A have relatively high steps per day if they have high balanced self-efficacy. So this tells us that balanced self-efficacy moderates the relationship between this measure of walking capacity and steps per day. Now, on the one hand, that could be a very good thing, right? That if you have high confidence in your balance abilities, that's going to moderate your physical capacity, the impact of your physical capacity on your steps per day. On the other hand, that could be a very bad thing. If someone has a very low score on the F.P.T.A, but feels very confident in their walking, they may be out and about and getting higher steps per day that may be then potentially putting them at risk for complications relative to falls, etc. But the important point that I want to draw out here is that there's potentially these complicated relationships between many of these measures that are impacting real world walking. And it's really important, if we're going to design targeted interventions that are really going to be optimal for individual patients, that we begin to really understand these relationships even more so. And so that's the work that we're currently doing in our lab. And, one of the things that we really wanted to understand is, how are these factors interacting, and how might we understand sort of subgroups of stroke survivors that might exist with respect to their walking behavior? And so that's the work that we're really embarking on now. We don't really know how these different factors interact in potentially different subgroups that might then help us understand, okay, if there's a subgroup of people that have particular characteristics that might be impacting their real-world walking, that would be really helpful to know. So if my patient fell into this subgroup, I would understand then the factors that I might need to be tackling with that particular patient if I wanted them to be able to walk more. And this is really the research question that we're tackling at this point in our lab. And this is really being spearheaded by Allison Miller. She's a Ph.D. student in my lab right now. She's a P.T. And an NCS. And her basic research question that she's tackling in her dissertation is, what variables are important in distinguishing subgroups of stroke survivors with respect to their real-world walking activity? And then how, once we understand that, how might we develop targeted interventions? So the sample that we're using is actually a sample of subjects that are part of a large clinical trial that I'll be talking about that we're doing called ProWalks. That's a 4-site clinical trial, and it's I'm the PI, and it's being led out of the University of Delaware. These are the sites that are involved in this study. But what we've been able to do is take the baseline measurements from this study. All of the folks in this study wear a Fitbit activity monitor for their baseline pre-intervention, to collect pre-intervention data. And we're able to use this data for this study. This is just the basic information about the sample. It's a large sample. Right now we're at 284 participants, and we're trying to be a fairly broad inclusion and exclusion criteria, because we're trying to capture a sample that is best represents folks that we might be seeing in physical therapy living with chronic stroke. And so our criteria are fairly broad, as you can see here. As I mentioned, right now we've got the data that I'm going to present for you today is a sample of about 200, it's exactly a sample of 283 participants living with chronic stroke. And here's their basic information that just sort of gives you some ideas of the study sample. Specifically, what I want to draw your attention to is these are folks that are at least 6 months post-stroke, and they also have to have a gait speed of at least 0.3 meters per second to be enrolled in the study. And that's due to the fact that the Fitbit activity monitor that they're wearing on their ankle is not very accurate for people with stroke with walking speeds below 0.3 meters per second. And so really the statistical analysis, the statistical approach that we're taking here is to really understand the variables that differentiate subgroups of stroke survivors with respect to their real-world walking behavior. So we did a latent class analysis. For actually really to be more specific, we did a mixture model, but the basis of it is really a latent class analysis. And what we're really trying to do here is to identify the subgroups within our sample of 283 people. So in this type of analysis, the individuals were classified into subgroups based on similar characteristics, with the goal of really creating homogeneous subgroups within our diverse sample. So if you take this figure as an example, here would be our whole population of stroke survivors. And what we're really trying to do is using the characteristics that we have in our study, we're trying to break them out into homogeneous subgroups where the characteristics are similar in each subgroup, but distinct amongst the subgroups. And this latent class analysis approach is really, therefore, a person-centered approach, which really differs from a variable-centered approach, which is often seen in, for example, like the regression models that I showed you earlier that we had done. which is really trying to understand the relationship between the variables. Here what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand the characteristics of the people in each subgroup. And so the variables of interest that we were entering into our latent class analysis, or our mixture model, we broke down into various categories that the literature has really suggested might be important categories for variables that impact real-world walking and chronic stroke. So we have our category of physical capacity, our category of cognition, our category of physical health, our category of psychosocial variables, and our category of social and physical environmental variables. Representing the physical capacity, we have the 6-minute walk test and self-selected gait speed. Representing the category of cognition, we have the MoCA. Representing the category of physical health, we have their LDL levels, their Charlson Comorbidity Index age-adjusted, and their BMI. Representing the category of psychosocial factors, we have that ABC balanced self-confidence or self-efficacy measure again. And we have the PHQ, which is a measure, a screening tool for depression. And representing the social and physical environment, we have living situation and marital status, work status, the area deprivation index, and the walk score. And these are measures that, specifically the area deprivation index is a measure some of you may not be familiar with. It's just a composite index of neighborhood socioeconomic disadvantage that uses various indicators of poverty, education, housing, and employment within regions of the U.S., and we're able to get this based on knowing the exact address of all of the participants in our study. And the walk score is similar in the sense that it uses the patient's address to get it uses a geographically based algorithm to provide an estimate of neighborhood walkability. So we enter all of those variables into the model, and then what the model does is using basically selection criteria, and I don't want to get into all of those details in this sort of more 30,000-foot view, but I can talk about that and answer questions more at the end. But basically, there's lots of objective model selection criteria that we use to try to figure out what is the best number of models or best number of subgroups that really represent our data. And based on that different model selection criteria, we ended up with 3 groups. In group 1, we had 70 of the participants, group 2 had 92 participants, and group 3 had 121 participants. So now at this point, what we know is that based on the variables we put in, we can separate our participants into these 3 groups. And then the next question we want to understand is, what are the variables that significantly differentiate these 3 subgroups? And so that's what I'm showing you here. The variables in red are the variables that differentiated the subjects in these 3 subgroups. So we have both of our measures of physical capacity. We have the MoCA. We have the ABC. We have work status, ADI, and walk score. And these are the variables that significantly differentiated our 3 subgroups. The next question that we're asking ourselves is, okay, what are the characteristics of the people in these 3 subgroups relative to these variables that differentiate the subgroups? So in group 1, we have our measures of physical capacity, self-efficacy, cognition, and the environment. And it turns out that all of the people in group 1 have the lowest measures on these variables. In contrast, all the subjects in group 3 have the highest measures on these variables. And then all of the subjects in group 2 are the subjects that are kind of in the middle on these variables, okay? Normally is the time, if we weren't in such a big group, I would pause and ask for questions, because I know this is a lot and maybe a little bit of a complicated analysis. Hopefully you're hanging in there with me, because we're getting to the punchline. And the punchline is that after we analyze these differences in the variables of interest and how they differentiate these people in these different subgroups, the next question is really, or the next piece of the analysis is really gets at answering our research question. And what we're trying to understand now is, are these groups actually different in terms of their daily stepping activity? And so that was the next step in the analysis. And what we found is that indeed they are. So class 1 had the lowest number of steps per day, class 2 had a medium number of steps per day, and class 3 had the highest number of steps per day. And these were significantly different across these subgroups. So now what we can see is group 1, remember, had our lowest measures on physical capacity, self-efficacy, cognition, and environmental factors. And this also was the group that had the lowest level of walking activity. On the flip side, our group 3, with the highest scores in all of these domains, also had the highest amount of walking activity. The thing that is really, really important to understand about this analysis is that an alternative possibility could have been could have easily happened. It could have happened that we have these subgroups that we were able to determine based on these variables of interest, but that differed on these variables of interest, but that didn't differ on their steps per day. And if that would have happened, what it would have told us is that, yes, there are these subgroups, but they're not really meaningful when it comes to understanding real-world walking activity. And that's not what happened here. But if that had happened, it really, the fact that that didn't happen really sends a powerful message, because we did not enter steps per day as a variable of interest into our model. It turns out that based on these other variables, we came up with these subgroups. And then we asked the question, do these subgroups differ on steps per day? And it turns out that they do, without steps per day even being included in the model. And so we can feel very confident that these factors that differentiate these subgroups also are very important in differentiating people on these steps per day variables. And so they become potentially, it tells us that these variables that differentiate these subgroups potentially are very important targets for intervention. And so now that we understand these subgroups of people and the factors that differentiate these subgroups, these become targets that we could attack when we're trying to improve steps per day or real-world walking after stroke. And the question then becomes, how would we do this? And so I want to quickly end with an intervention that we're implementing in our lab that really uses step activity monitoring programs. Some key pieces of a step activity monitoring program are that you use some kind of device to monitor step activity. We're using the Fitbit 1 or the Fitbit Ultra on the ankle of the non-paretic limb, because that is the place where you can get the most accurate measurements from the Fitbit, although I will mention that the Fitbit is not accurate for people with walking speeds below 0.3 meters per second that are living with chronic stroke. The other key piece of a step activity monitoring program is to set a daily stepping activity goal. And that goal setting should occur in partnership with the patients. Ultimately, patients should arrive at their own goal, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the third key piece of a step activity monitoring program is to identify barriers to activity and strategies to overcome them. At each session, it's really important that you discuss with patients the number of steps per day that they're taking, and that you discuss with them whether or not those steps per day attain the goal that they've set for themselves. If a PT is delivering this intervention, as they are for our study, the PT's role is really as a facilitator, a facilitator of the patient, not as a deliverer of information about what the patient should do. And I want to talk about this for a minute because this is really important. In our study, we're utilizing techniques from motivational interviewing. And really the goal of motivational interviewing is to strengthen the importance of change from the patient's perspective. And the reason we're using this is because it's been shown in lots of behavioral intervention studies like alcohol or smoking cessation, that this is a technique that is very, very helpful when you're trying to get people to change their behavior. And ultimately, when we're tackling a lot of these factors that we're talking about, that we've identified in the previous study, we're really trying to get people to change their behavior. And there's 4 basic principles to enhance motivation in motivational interviewing, which I've identified here. Expressions of empathy, development of discrepancy, rolling with resistance from the participant, and the support of self-efficacy. And so when we're talking with our patients, some examples of things that we're saying, rather than saying to the patient, like I would have done before I was informed about these things, I would have said to the patient, look, you're not meeting your goal. You really need to, work harder on getting more steps per day. Using a more motivational interviewing technique, I might say something like, from what you've been sharing with me, I know you feel as though it will be difficult to walk more, but what are the ways in which you think you can improve your daily walking activity? Or, I understand you feel it's much harder to walk physically since you've had your stroke, but we're working on building up your endurance. And week by week, we're doing this in physical therapy. And we're doing this goal by goal with the aim being that, you'll be able to walk more by the end of the monitoring program. So that is sort of helping to build their self-efficacy, explaining to them what we're doing to try to help make it easier for them. Also to build self-efficacy, saying things like, you did a really nice job of meeting your current goal. How are you going to tackle meeting your advanced goal for next week? Helping them identify the barriers and then thinking about helping them think about ways they could attack those barriers. So saying something like, I know in bad weather you normally choose to walk in the mall. If it rains this week like it's projected, will you do more laps in the mall as opposed to the outdoor track like you've been doing? So you can see here that the approach really is more one of engaging the patient in coming up with solutions rather than the therapist or the medical practitioner telling the patient what to do. And it's been shown in research with motivational interviewing relative to behavioral change that this really enhances behavioral change. So when it comes to identifying barriers, think back now to our previous study and what we discussed about the physical environment and its role. Remember, we said neighborhood walkability and measures of socioeconomic disadvantage in the place where the person lives is really important in distinguishing these subgroups. So if social support or the physical environment is a barrier, what about taking more frequent short walks in and around their home? Remember the P.T.A. paper that I talked to you about early from the LEAP study? And one of the recommendations was, hey, maybe we need to be encouraging our patients to take more bouts of walking and more short bouts. Well, that plays right into what we have found, that if the environment is a big...
Yeah, I didn't do, the only thing I'm doing is like adding in the...
if you can mute yourself, that would be really great. Thanks. So, but based on what we found in our study, remember that these environmental and social factors were a key in subgrouping. And so if you have a patient who has, in particular, a neighborhood that's not very walkable, this might be a really, really relevant suggestion to help them improve their daily walking activity. Think back to what we talked about relative to cognition. We said that, one of the distinguishing factors for that low walking activity group was low scores on the MOCA. And so if you know that, you've got to think about, maybe we need to think about a reminder system via alarms or a schedule to remind these patients to get up and walk, right? If they have these cognitive deficits, it might make it difficult for them to be self-initiating. And indeed, we found in a very small study of stroke survivors that using a step activity monitoring program with all of these characteristics I talked about, and just simply doing that, having the patients come in once a week, meeting with us, doing nothing else, no other physical intervention, we were able to get about a 1,500 steps per day increase. We then combined that with a physical intervention where we had people do treadmill and overground walking training. Again, a small pilot feasibility and efficacy study, pilot efficacy study, where we combined the step activity monitoring program with a program of trying to build up their physical capacity, training for 3 times a week for 12 weeks. And these are some basic characteristics of the study and the sample, and there's the reference for you if you want to look in more detail. But what we found in this really early study is that there was this interaction piece between people's physical abilities and how they benefited from the combined physical and step activity monitoring intervention, such that people with the lowest levels of pre-training steps per day had the biggest change in steps per day in the combined intervention program, the program where we were combining building up their physical capacity with the step activity monitoring program. And even though this was done pre the study where we identified the subgroups, it lines up perfectly, right, with what we would expect, that the people who are taking these lowest steps per day are probably the people who really need this very multifaceted approach to if we're going to see improvements in their daily walking activity. And this is just these subgroups of people plotted in a bar graph over here in terms of their change in steps per day. You can see in that very low subgroup, the people who had the combined intervention really tackling many of the different features that put them sort of in that subgroup relative to low walking activity. When they got that combined intervention, they did far better than people in their subgroup that just got the intervention that was just attacking physical capacity. So now we're looking at a larger clinical trial, a phase 2 clinical trial, where we're this 4-site ProWalk study, where we're trying to really expand the intervention, not just having the physical capacity building plus the step activity monitoring program, but also looking at the physical capacity building alone and the step activity monitoring alone, because based on those subgroups that you saw, you might expect that depending on the subgroup that the person's in, these various interventions might lead to different improvements for people in the different subgroups. And that's one of the things that we hypothesize and that we're going to be able to look at in this large clinical trial. And we've just got a little schematic here of the large clinical trial, and here's our clinicaltrials.gov number if people are interested. Our primary outcome for this study is steps per day. Here's our secondary and exploratory outcomes, and our goal is to randomize about 250 people, and we're just over the 200 mark, so we're getting there. COVID has dealt us a serious blow in our ability, but we're back up and running now, and so we're hoping to finish out our recruitment of the clinical trial this year. So stay tuned on whether these targeted interventions really do impact these people in these different subgroups as you might predict. So in summary, I just want to leave you with, the main thing that we know from the literature is that stroke survivors are generally pretty sedentary and not as physically active in the real world as we would like, both for their community mobility, but also to prevent them from developing future health conditions that are related to this sedentary behavior. We know that there are multiple factors that impact real-world walking activity after stroke, including not only their physical capacity, but also balance, self-efficacy, cognition, and physical and social environmental factors. We preliminarily have begun to look at programs aimed at improving all of these factors, and it looks preliminarily like those programs that address those multiple factors for those people that are in that subgroup with low scores in cognition, social and physical environment, physical capacity, and self-efficacy, that those that very multifaceted approach may be the most beneficial, but more to come on that. I also just wanted to mention we have lots of other work going on in our lab that I think is probably of interest to the very diverse group of people we have in the audience. Most specifically, we have a lot of work going on looking at the interaction of cognition and motor learning after stroke. And this is Maggie French, who many of you know from her time at Hopkins. She came to Delaware to get her Ph.D. and she successfully defended, yay Maggie, on Friday, and is going to be coming back down to Hopkins for a postdoc. And Maggie's been very instrumental in a lot of the work in the lab looking at the interaction of cognition and motor learning after stroke, specifically as it relates to walking. And Joseph Kim at UD is also involved in this work, as well as Suzanne Morton, who many of you know. I saw Jen Keller's name pop up, and Jen and Suzanne go way back. And so we're all collaborating on this work. We also have some computational modeling work relative to both this work that I've presented today, as well as our motor learning pieces that I'd be happy to talk to people about either in the question and answer or at another time. We have lower extremity robotics work with Jill Higginson and Fabrizio Sergei here at UD. Some work looking at balance and falls with Jeremy Crenshaw. Custom-built orthotics with Elisa Arch. These are all folks at UD. And then I'm part of a 3-site clinical trial looking at high-intensity interval training in people living with chronic stroke, and that's a clinical trial led by Pierce Boyne and Carrie Dunning at the University of Cincinnati. University of Delaware is a site, as well as Sandy Billinger is a site PI at the University of Kansas. Of course, you know, all of this work really is the result of the many people currently in the lab and past people in the lab. I've been super lucky to work with just amazing and talented people. You know, they're really the ones that help carry out all of this exciting work that I'm so privileged to be a part of. And last but not least, this is our beautiful building on the Star campus. A number of years ago, we graduated from a windowless basement clinic to a beautiful building with lots of windows and lots of sunlight, which we haven't got to spend nearly enough time in lately, but would really welcome any of you to come up and pay us a visit just up 95 from you guys in Newark, Delaware. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. I don't know if
Darcy, thank you. It was, I mean, this was great presentation and great work. And I think maybe others will have questions, or maybe P.D. are collecting questions. I would suggest that if people want to jump in and ask directly or send questions via the chat, either P.D. or I can read them. While folks are thinking, I have a question for you, Darcy. Since I'm talking, I'm just launching. So very interesting work about this idea of stratifying people by the subgroups, by all these categories. And it shows nicely, okay, you can classify folks into the 3 different groups, and then you go back and you understand that those different groups behave differently when you look at your accelerometer, your amount of walking step. Now, it's very costly and time-consuming to measure all those other things, and it's much more cheaper and maybe accessible eventually to give it to a person. So are you looking into do the reverse, which I know from the presentation we cannot infer that it's going to be the case, but are you looking to do the reverse, where you say, okay, can I measure something in a very easy, cheaply manner and accessible, and then infer all these other elements that can inform approaches for rehab?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at this point, yeah, we just we definitely would like to do that. I think what you're really asking, Pablo, is there an easy biomarker, right, that we could measure that would help us understand better these subgroups? I think that we don't know. What I would like to suggest is that based on what we're seeing, and we don't know this because we have not done the reverse, but if your patient is in a very low walking activity group, it appears from our data that the likelihood of them having low cognitive scores, low physical capacity, low self-efficacy is pretty high, right? And so until we get the answer, my clinical suggestion would be you might have access to their cognitive scores from speech therapy or whatever, you might not, but you probably have a pretty good idea from working with them, you know, whether they might have those issues. And if it appears that they do, I think you better think about a comprehensive approach that is addressing not just their physical capacity, but also these other features as well, if you want to actually get them more physically active. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that makes sense. And clearly you're saying that the big picture message is that doing simply, you know, more walking, more exercise is not going to drive the needle, you know, push the ultimate goal of increasing physical capacity forward. The way I like to frame it is it's a necessary but not sufficient intervention. So, you know, I grew up, my PhD is in biomechanics and movement science. I grew up completely focused on the gait pattern, the characteristics of walking. And what my work over the last 10 years has really showed me is that is necessary, right? People have to have the physical ability, but it's not sufficient. For many people, and by the way, for the people in the higher category group, it might be sufficient, right? Those people with high physical activity also had high physical capacity. So it might be that for some people, if you can really get them to a high level of walking ability, it might be sufficient. But certainly our work is suggesting for these people with lower levels of physical capacity, just improving their physical capacity is not going to be enough. So necessary condition, but not sufficient condition. Does that? Yeah.
I would not want to give the impression that we should not be working on physical capacity, because, you know, that would be very bad for physical medicine and rehab.
Sure.
Should be working on it, but it's not enough.
Yeah, that's great, Darcy. Now, your classifications have been based on patients with chronic stroke, correct? Do you have any, you know, if it were a cohort of acute stroke, would your recommendations be any different, or can you elaborate on that?
I think the subgroups could be different, because I think that, for example, really early on, if physical capacity is really limited, early on it may trump social environment, right? Or physical environment. I don't know. And I'm at University of Delaware. We don't have a big medical system. We don't have a medical school, so I don't have great access to acute or subacute stroke. But I know at Hopkins you certainly do. So, I mean, I think that's, you know, really great food for thought. And by the way, I think you collect a lot of this information in your medical record. So I think we don't know. We don't know how these factors change, the weight of these factors change over time, but we could guess that they do. And I think that is super important.
Great. You know, we'll be talking to you offline to sort of see how we can synergize to answer that question. But thank you. I know people in the audience must have a lot of questions, because you know, this is actually something that we are very involved in, Darcy, just FYI. And that's why we are so eager to have Maggie join us. We are planning to look at subgroups prospectively, and you know, look at how some of these factors actually inform their recovery and potentially intervene. And you know, while other people are coming up with their questions, I just wonder, have you experienced any major barriers? You know, I think it's using motivational interviewing techniques to sort of improve self-efficacy is really fantastic, right? Because so many times we know what the patients need to do, but to get them to do it is a whole other matter. Have you, and I'm thinking, if it were me, what kind of barriers might have? Oh, my knee hurts, or, I'm too stiff, and there's so many reasons or excuses, if you will, when you have a disability. And I'm just wondering, were there any such barriers that you experienced, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so I think, the results of the ProWalks clinical trial will really tell us how effective we are in using these motivational interviewing techniques to help patients overcome their barriers. We're hypothesizing based on these step activity monitoring programs being effective. We know that they've been effective in, for example, heart failure, patients with diabetes, et cetera, but we don't know if they're effective in chronic stroke. What I will tell you is that when we started our so prior to ProWalks, when we did our feasibility study, one of the things that we were so surprised by is how difficult it was for patients to come up with ways to be more active. The way I like to approach it is, patient comes home from hopefully inpatient rehab, right? They're maybe getting home therapy, maybe getting outpatient therapy. And very often, they're not very mobile. And so they kind of set up their lives to limit the amount of mobility they have to have. And then as they continue to recover, they don't adjust that, right? And so, the spouse that got accustomed to delivering the lunch on a TV tray continues to deliver the lunch on a TV tray, even though the person is fully capable of walking into the kitchen to have their lunch or the dining room or whatever. And what we were really surprised about was, we had to really probe patients to say, okay, well, let's think back. What was your day like before you had a stroke? What were things that you were doing? And lo and behold, they would say, I could walk down to the mailbox and get the mail. My spouse doesn't need to be doing that anymore. I could do that, but I just hadn't been, and I didn't think of it, right? And so we have found, starting there with these small little bits of these short walking bouts. That's why I emphasize that data from the LEAPS trial, right? It's very overwhelming to people to say, I need you to go to the track and walk 5 laps around the track, or I need you to mall walk or whatever. We are finding that it's much easier to get the patients to reflect on how they can improve their mobility just in and around their home, and then build from there. So I don't know if that answers your question, Preeti, but that's sort of what we've been finding in the implementation side of this.
Thank you, Darcy. That was
I see people turning their cameras on. Does that mean
yes.
they want to talk?
Please speak up.
I think I have a question. Nice to talk to you again.
I got it right this time, right?
Yes, you did. Thanks. A couple years ago, we had a CVA stroke support group while they're on inpatient rehab, and a big part of it was goal setting. And I like how you talked about it. It's a huge struggle for people to talk about their own goals and to motivate themselves. And with using a fitness tracker with steps per day, I can know they can have some data they can reflect on. My question is, how often did they have to see the data and have those motivational interviewing interventions to find it to be effective?
Yep.
But our goal setting was once a week, and I felt like it wasn't enough to create change.
Yep. So in that really very, very small early study that I showed you with 16 people where we just did the step activity monitoring program and nothing else, they were coming in once a week. And they came in once a week for 4 weeks. And we didn't really feel like that was sort of just a proof of concept, and we didn't really feel like that was as effective as it needed to be. So in our study that was the preliminary study to ProWalks, we did 3 times a week because we felt that was more standard outpatient like visiting. And so they got information 3 times a week. At that time, we were using a research grade pedometer, which would not show them the data other than when they came in. So they were only getting information 3 times a week, which again, we did not feel was ideal based on literature in other populations using step activity monitoring programs, which is why we switched to the Fitbit so that they can see data, they can see their data they use it just like you and I would use it, right? Like I'm like, oh my God, it's 12 o'clock and I've walked 1,000 steps. This is an atrocity. I've got to get up and do something. The problem is for the Fitbit to have reasonable accuracy in stroke, it's got to be worn on the non-paretic ankle. And they put it on their sock or we give them a band. That's a bit of a pain, if you're a stroke survivor, to like get that ankle up there where you can see those little numbers on your Fitbit. So that's the only thing that we found to be kind of problematic. But certainly the literature would support that, just like for you and I, the more they can get information about how much they're doing, the better. And that's even part of the motivational interviewing. We ask them questions like, well, how often a day are you looking at your Fitbit? And, do you think that's enough? And, well, again, back to this thing, we have patients with cognitive deficits. And so we've worked with them to set alarms that, they're going to have these alarms 3 times a day, and they're going to check their Fitbit. And, what are they going to do if their Fitbit is below a certain amount, And so it's that back and forth. But to answer your question directly, really, I think the more the better that they can see how much they're doing. And then right now, we don't know we don't know the results, but we're doing 3 times a week. Just because we thought that was feasible.
Great, thank you very much.
Dr. Reisman, if I could just offer just a general thank you for making this presentation attainable for therapists like myself who are not specifically physical therapists, and I think thematically generalizable to what we all do. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I hoped so. So at least one person thinks so.
Agreed.
Thank you. I think Stephen Wegner is.
Yeah, I put a little post up there on the chat. So I want to draw your attention to a key thing that we should take away from this. And that is, you put up a slide before that showed your regression equation, right? And you put in the person's physical parameters, which explain some of the variance, but about a third. And then what you ended up doing is you built a model, of course, that went to added the unimportant things last, which of course accounted for more variance, right? Of course, this is, nothing, as I said in the post, there's nothing I like better than having excellent speakers from other disciplines talk about the primacy of behavioral principles in rehabilitation, right? And this is something that we all need to keep in mind is, if you go back and you look at the papers, old literature, 20, 30 years old, on spinal cord injury, the best predictor of someone's quality of life is not the level of injury. Being a tetra or a para does not predict your quality of life, your life satisfaction, or your level of depression. It's your social support, your self-efficacy, and all these other categories, right? So, we get often so caught up, the principle, obviously there's some important research questions here, but, in medicine, we're always thinking, what is the person's diagnosis and what's their physical parameters, which of course are foundational, but not determinant. And, So nothing I like I said, nothing I like better than having an outstanding speaker talking about how important behavioral and psychological principles are. Right? And we're always happy to be of service, and feel free to use the stuff as much as you possibly can.
Well, and I think, so thank you for that. And I know Maggie is really excited to work with you, because we're, I always joke around, for years, as a physical therapist for years, I know how important the role of cognition, for example, is. But we're just like, oh, yeah, cognition, whatever. But we're going to focus over here on their gait, right? It gets to a point where you're like, this is ridiculous. We cannot ignore this, because if ultimately our goal is to have these folks live the richest, most fulfilling life they can, right? Which I think is everybody on this call, that would be their goal. It doesn't matter that my discipline is physical therapy, right? If that's our goal, we've got to bring together the information we have. I love the fact that you guys are so lucky at Hopkins to have such an ability to work with amazing interdisciplinary folks. What I didn't point out in this talk, and I am so remiss in not doing this, and I really apologize, and Steve's comment made me realize it. We have several psychologists working with us on this. I am not an expert. I could not do this as a physical therapist by myself. We have a neuropsychologist who's been very instrumental, as well as a more general psychologist in sort of the cognitive domain, who's been very instrumental in helping us. But we are only scratching the surface, right? I think there is so much more to be done with our colleagues from speech and language pathology, from our colleagues in psychology, from our colleagues in behavioral health and nutrition. There's lots of disciplines that we could be even doing a better job of, all working together and bringing our knowledge. So thank you, Stephen, for pointing that out. And that's why I start every talk with the WHO ICF model. Even though my students cringe, they're like, oh my God, could you stop with the WHO ICF? But it's so important. It just has to be the foundation, I think, for what we do.
Other questions from other folks?
I have one question. I'm David Mueller, a physical therapist. First off, I just really appreciated your thoroughness with just how much all the different areas that you guys are looking into. And it's super fun when you get to see those connections like you did with the amount of walking that people are doing. I was kind of curious with the environmental aspect and the walkability score that you mentioned, and just what factors into determining that? Like, is it how busy the roads are? Is it city versus suburb? Just, yeah, along those lines.
So for the ADI score, and I would encourage you guys, this is such an easy thing to do, and maybe some of you are already doing it. Basically, you just have to have their street address, and then there is a nationally available calculator. I think it's based originally out of the University of Wisconsin for the ADI. But basically, for the ADI, they're really looking at a lot of factors that have to sort of do with what you might think of as socioeconomic. They're looking at like the cost of housing, the average income. They're looking at things like the availability of, certain kinds of resources like healthcare and banks and, those kind of things. The ADI, that's the ADI. The walkability score is particularly interested in the walkability of your neighborhood. Things like, are there controlled crosswalks? Are there sidewalks? What are there parks and areas to walk in your neighborhood? Those kind of things. So, it's interesting because I gave this talk at Christiana Care Health System, which is a big health system here in Delaware. And there's several people who do research in diabetes, and they've been using the ADI. And they're also finding that when it comes to physical activity, the ADI is a very significant predictor in patients with diabetes, with how active they are. So this ADI and this walkability score may be something that kind of transcend specific diagnoses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where my mind was kind of going with it was like one, if it was kind of like based off of that, and then two, thinking about how like a lot of those things like parks and just like the infrastructure is kind of based off of like tax dollars and just even how much people are making in the community to have things contribute to that, and how like some organizations are kind of taking note of those inequities and doing a lot of advocacy wise with that, of just even connecting this data with that to just prove the health part of it as well.
I think
yeah.
That's exactly right. And those pieces are, so this is why how socioeconomic status disadvantage of a neighborhood kind of plays in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
On the flip side, can I just quickly say one more thing? I know we're going to run out of time, but there is some literature to suggest, however, that in very urban environments where the walkability might be low, if there's public transportation, that it actually can lead to higher activity because people are utilizing public transportation, which by its nature ends up causing them to walk more. So there could be, again, these are, you know, when you're looking at the whole person, there's a lot of really interesting complex interactions. I mention that because I think of Baltimore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And yes, some people here in Hopkins have access to this ABI. So if you are interested, I know you know, some of the folks who do a lot of this health disparities research and so on, they use a lot of this ABI as variable to control for different elements. So there are folks who can help connect with those who have access to that directly, so we can take a look at that. Darcy, there was a nice question in the chat put there. I mean, a lot of thank yous and so on. You can take a look at that. But one question, I'm sure you're going to say yes, is asking if they can refer patients to your studies.
Oh my goodness, please, 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 please do. Yeah, absolutely. We would love to have anybody that you think might be interested. And the best way, I think, at this point is just to feel free to give them my email address.
Great. Do they need to be local or to Delaware, or could they be from?
They can be from anywhere. And surprisingly, we do get people. So a lot of people who come to you guys are kind of from that Central Maryland area that's not actually so far to come to Newark. So yeah, they can.
Great.
I mean, we're not at this point, we're not housing people. I think if that's your question, at this point we're not housing people. But if as long as they can get here.
Perfect. Good. I think that's going to be helpful for folks. I don't know, Preeti, or other questions.
Yeah, Darcy, can I request you to put your email on the chat?
Oh, yes.
So people would have it?
Yep.
Thanks. Well, you know, I just want to say that we had over 115 people on this listening to you, Darcy, from, you know, all the various disciplines. So your talk really addressed sort of the comprehensive nature of rehabilitation, and there was something for everyone. So really, thank you very much. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, you know, and I think it's touching pretty much what everybody is working on, you know, from some angle or from one angle or another. So really couldn't have wanted more. So really thank you very much for this very engaging talk, and thank you for also visiting the posters at the expo. And I hope this will be the seed for more discussions on how we can collaborate on some of these questions.
I would love that. And it was so great to see so many familiar faces. Shout out to Mark Hopkins, Jen Keller, Michael Schubert, Ryan Remish. I don't know, I'm sure there's other people I know whose names I just didn't get to see. So thanks so much for inviting me. Hi, Ryan. Thanks so much for inviting me. I always love, you guys have such a great group, and I would love to work with you all more.
Great.
All right. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Darcy. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and happy holidays for anybody who I don't see before then.
Hi, Kelly. Okay, bye.
Bye.